It's kind of striking, right? When you see India making headlines globally, you hear about the fast-growing economy, all the advancements in space exploration, really becoming a digital powerhouse. But then, you also come across these stories of widespread poverty, hundreds of millions still struggling. It's that contrast, that paradox that we're going to try to get our heads around in this deep dive. You send over some really fascinating material, and I think our aim here is to really understand, why this contrast exists. Why does this poverty endure in India alongside all this progress and potential? We're going to sort of dig into the historical roots, the current challenges, kind of see how the past is shaping the present.
Yeah, it's a really layered issue. You're right. And as your sources kind of illustrate, there's no single answer. I think what's really interesting is how everything's so interconnected. Historical events, social structures, economic policies, they all kind of come together to create the reality we see in India today.
Okay, so let's unpack some of this then. Maybe starting with looking back, going back to the colonial era, almost 2 centuries of British rule. That's got to leave a mark, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that really stood out in the material you shared was this idea of systematic deindustrialization. What did that actually mean, practically speaking, for India's economy?
Okay, well, you see the British, they weren't just interested in political control. Their economic agenda was really front and center. India had, all these thriving traditional industries like textiles, for instance. The colonial administration, they basically went about dismantling these industries to create a market for their own goods. They would impose tariffs, create trade policies that basically favored British imports and choked Indian production. It was a drain of resources, both raw materials and just wealth flowing out of India to Britain. And that left India in a really, really weakened state economically, by the time independence came in 47. And it wasn't just a missed opportunity for growth. They actively undermined the industries that existed.
So it was more than just, a chance missed. It was actually taking something away that was already there. And then obviously independence in 47, that's huge. But then the partition, the sources point to that as another big setback.
Exactly. Partition was, it was just this incredibly disruptive event. The consequences are still felt today. Politically, it led to the creation of 2 separate nations, right? And there's ongoing geopolitical tension because of that. Economically, it totally messed up existing trade relationships, disrupted agriculture, just logistical nightmares. And then socially, the amount of people who were displaced, the sheer scale of violence, it caused so much suffering, and it further destabilized the newly independent India. It was just this huge fracturing, on so many levels, and the repercussions are still felt today.
So fast forward to today, the sheer scale of India's population, now the biggest in the world, over 1.4 billion people. That has to be a massive factor in this whole poverty situation, just putting so much pressure on resources, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's this idea of the demographic dividend, meaning a large young population could actually fuel economic growth if they're educated and employed, right? But the reality is that in India's case, the strain on resources, things like land and water, is immense. Just imagine you're trying to provide for this ever-growing population with resources that aren't growing at the same rate. So you get things like agricultural land being divided into smaller and smaller plots, which makes farming less efficient. And then in urban areas, you see these overcrowded slums where people lack basic sanitation, clean water, essential services. The growth in infrastructure just hasn't kept up with the population boom.
Yeah, and it seems like that kind of leads into this really critical point that comes up a lot in the material. Even with all the economic growth that India is experiencing, the benefits aren't being distributed evenly at all. That statistic that the richest 10% hold over 70% of the country's wealth, that's pretty stark. What does that really mean on the ground, that level of inequality?
Well, what it means is that, you have some sectors and regions in India, particularly some of the southern states, that have seen huge development. But vast areas, especially rural areas and parts of the north and east, they've really been left behind. So what you see is a lack of basic infrastructure, like reliable electricity, good roads, clean water, healthcare facilities. And this just perpetuates a cycle of poverty. If you don't have access to these things, your opportunities to get education, to get healthcare, to just improve your life, they're limited. And this uneven development, it creates social tensions as well.
And you can't talk about development without talking about governance, right? The sources you sent were pretty upfront about corruption and bureaucracy being major obstacles in India. How does this, this reality of corruption, how does that actually affect the lives of people living in poverty?
Well, corruption is like a leak in the system, right? It siphons off resources that are meant for development. So money allocated for poverty alleviation programs, for education, for infrastructure, when that gets misused at different levels of government or just lost in bureaucracy, the people who need it the most, they don't get the support they were supposed to. And then there's all the red tape, the inefficiency, these endless bureaucratic processes that delay projects, that discourage investment. You could have great policies, but if they can't be implemented effectively, they won't have the impact they should. It just undermines the whole system.
Education, it seems like that should be such a key way for people to escape poverty. But the sources point to some real concerns about the quality of education, even though access has improved. What are some of the challenges there in making sure education actually leads to real opportunities for people?
You're absolutely right. Enrollment rates are up, which is great, but the quality, especially in rural areas and some urban areas that are underserved, it's still a big worry. And it often comes down to things like, do you have enough qualified teachers? Is the infrastructure there? Are there enough resources? And the results is that a lot of students, they're not getting the basic skills and knowledge they need to compete in today's world, in the modern economy. So it's a vicious cycle, right? Poor education leads to a shortage of skilled workers, which can slow down economic growth. And then you have more unemployment, more underemployment. It's not just about getting kids into school, it's about what they learn there and the opportunities that that education gives them.
And talking about basic needs, healthcare access. It seems like that's another area where a lot of people in India face huge challenges. The sources painted a pretty stark contrast between overcrowded public hospitals and then the really expensive private care.
Yeah, it's a major problem. The public healthcare system, it's trying to serve this immense population, but it's often underfunded, overstretched, especially in rural areas where the need is greatest. So if you're living in poverty and you need medical care, it can be incredibly difficult to get timely and effective treatment. And then on the other hand, you have private health care, which is good, but it's often just too expensive for most people to afford. So this lack of access to health care, combined with issues like malnutrition, the high rates of communicable diseases, it all impacts people's ability to work, to earn a living. It even affects their life expectancy. So it really traps them in this cycle of poverty.
A large part of India's population is still dependent on agriculture, but the sources suggest that the sector's contribution to the overall GDP is relatively small. What are some of the vulnerabilities that farmers face? The things that keep them stuck in this cycle of rural poverty?
There are a number of issues. Many farmers in India, they work on very small plots of land. And that means they can't really benefit from economies of scale. They can't easily adopt more modern farming techniques. Then they're very reliant on the monsoon rains, which means they're at the mercy of droughts and floods, crop failures, financial hardship. It's a constant worry. The costs of things like fertilizers and seeds keep rising while the prices for their produce fluctuate wildly. So farmers often find themselves in really precarious financial situations. And the tragic reality of farmer suicides, often driven by debt and crop loss, it really highlights the desperation that exists. And then there's the lack of access to organized markets, places where they can sell their produce for a fair price. And the lack of access to modern technology, that makes it even harder for them to compete and improve their yields.
And it seems like all of this comes together, and you see this problem of unemployment and underemployment. Millions of young people entering the workforce every year, but not enough jobs, especially manufacturing and the formal sector. That sounds like a huge challenge.
It is. India has this vast young population, which, as we talked about with the demographic dividend, has the potential to be a real asset. But if the economy can't create enough good quality jobs, especially in areas like manufacturing, the formal service sector, this actually becomes a problem. So you have millions of young people looking for work but not finding it, which forces many of them into low-paying jobs in the informal sector where there's no security, no benefits. And then there's underemployment, where people are working in jobs below their skill level just because there's nothing better available. That's such a waste of potential, and it contributes to the persistence of poverty.
And then you can't ignore the social structures that are deeply ingrained in India, right? Things like caste-based discrimination, gender inequality, even though there are laws against these things. They must be huge barriers for people trying to escape poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. Caste-based discrimination, it's against the law. But the sad reality is that it continues to affect access to education, to jobs, to just moving up in society. These biases are so deep-rooted, and they prevent a huge section of the population from fully participating in the economy, from improving their lives. And then you have gender inequality, where women are underrepresented in the workforce, in politics, in leadership positions. And the violence against women, that's a major concern. It all holds women back, and it holds back the progress of society as a whole. So understanding these social factors is crucial when you're looking at the bigger picture of poverty in India.
And looking ahead, thinking about the future, the sources brought up some serious concerns about the environment and the impact of climate change.
Yeah.
How do those factors play into this whole issue of poverty?
Well, environmental degradation, climate change, these are increasing threats to poverty reduction efforts in India. Bad air quality, polluted water, these things have a direct impact on people's health, especially for those who are already vulnerable. It leads to higher healthcare costs, lower productivity. And then you have rising temperatures, unpredictable weather. It's already affecting agriculture. Crop yields are going down. Farmers are suffering. And then the natural disasters, the floods, droughts, cyclones, these are becoming more frequent and more intense. They displace people, they destroy infrastructure, and they can push people who are already struggling back into poverty. It sets back development, for years.
It really does paint a very complex picture. I mean, there's no one thing holding India back. It's this whole web of things. History, demographics, economic inequality, issues with governance, social problems, the environment. It's not that the potential isn't there, the resources aren't there.
That's exactly it. India has a lot going for it. A large dynamic workforce, a fast-growing economy, a lot of entrepreneurial spirit, a rich cultural heritage. The key takeaway here is that just having high economic growth, that's not enough. You need development that's inclusive, that benefits everyone.
So it sounds like focusing on those impressive GDP figures, that's not going to solve the problem. The material really highlighted the need for inclusive development, for stronger governance, for really investing in people, in their education, their health, giving them real opportunities.
That's right. To really tackle poverty in a sustainable way, you need growth that lifts up all parts of society, not just a select few. You need good governance, where there's transparency, accountability, where resources are used effectively, and you absolutely have to invest in human capital. Good education, accessible healthcare, skills development programs, that's how you empower people to break out of poverty and contribute to the country's progress. Reducing inequality in all its forms, economic, social, geographic, that's absolutely crucial.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into an incredibly important issue. We've looked at all these interconnected challenges, the deep-rooted problems. So for you, listening out there, I'd like to leave you with a question to consider. What do you think is the single most crucial area for India to focus on in the years ahead, to really unlock its potential and finally address this issue of poverty? It's clearly a complex puzzle with many pieces, and your perspective on this is really valuable.